You think you know the Byzantine Empire, but you've only seen its golden domes and mosaics. History books tell us of Hagia Sophia's majesty, its soaring dome gleaming like heaven's gateway. They remind us of emperors crowned by God, of sacred relics paraded through streets while choirs echoed with divine hymns. Byzantium is remembered as the Holy Empire of the East, a civilization that fused faith and power, law and glory. To the world, it was the bastion of Christianity, the guardian of civilization after Rome's fall. But behind those jeweled walls, another story was unfolding, one the chroniclers wrote carefully, if at all. Beneath the robes of piety and sanctity, the palace chambers became a theatre of desire, betrayal, and forbidden power. Empresses, who were celebrated as symbols of virtue, were in truth masters of survival. They wielded intimacy not only as pleasure, but as weapon, seducing emperors, manipulating factions, and orchestrating scandals that decided the fate of dynasties. Behind every icon of holiness lay whispers of coercion, hidden lovers, and conspiracies drowned in blood. The contrast is chilling. Byzantium projected itself as God's kingdom on earth, yet its most sacred palace was filled with secrets that would have shocked the faithful who prayed outside its gates. Women cloaked in silk and sanctity bent emperors to their will, while rivals disappeared in silence, poisoned or exiled far from the Golden City. The same hands that lit candles at chapels also signed decrees of vengeance. The empire of holy light was also an empire of shadowed chambers. And so the question arises, how did these empresses, cloaked in piety, turn intimacy into politics? How did they bend the language of holiness to hide acts of seduction, betrayal, and control? The answer lies not in the glittering mosaics that still shine today, but in the forbidden stories buried beneath them. Stories of women whose power was both celebrated and feared, remembered only through whispers of scandal. This is the Byzantium few dare to reveal, a world where sanctity masked scandal, where behind golden walls the fate of empires was written not in scripture, but in secrets. The Byzantine Empire is often remembered as a miracle of endurance. For over 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, it stood as a glittering fortress of Christianity, a beacon of order in a chaotic world. Its capital, Constantinople, rose like a dream at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, crowned with soaring domes, shimmering mosaics, and walls said to be unbreachable. To admirers, Byzantium was not merely a state, it was God's chosen kingdom on earth, a civilization destined to outshine all others. This is the myth that history has polished for centuries, the empire of holy relics and divine rulers, of Hagia Sophia standing as a monument to faith, of emperors crowned not just by men, but by heaven itself. Chroniclers emphasized Byzantium's sacred mission, its role as defender of orthodoxy, and its majesty as the last true heir of Rome. To this day, popular imagination sees Byzantium as a holy empire of golden light, unmarred by the corruption of other courts. But myths are crafted as much by silence as by memory. For every story of divine coronations, there were secrets that never made it into the official record. The same walls that housed holy icons also witnessed betrayals whispered in candlelit corridors. Eunuchs guarded doors where forbidden meetings unfolded. And within the palace, empresses, cloaked in jewels and devotion, maneuvered with strategies that shocked even their enemies. The myth of civilization masked a reality of constant intrigue, where holiness was the mask, and hunger for power was the truth. Part of this illusion was deliberate. Byzantine chroniclers were often monks or churchmen, men who believed the empire was God's chosen vessel. Their writings emphasized piety, law, and continuity, downplaying scandal or burying it in vague language. Empresses were praised for their faith, their beauty, or their charity, while their rumored affairs, manipulations, and cruelties were left as hushed accusations. What could not be erased was often reframed. An act of vengeance became divine justice, a forbidden love retold as pious devotion, yet whispers survived. Foreign envoys returned home with tales of palace decadence, of empresses accused of taking lovers, of rival factions poisoning one another at feasts. Later, Western chroniclers repeated these stories, but often exaggerated them into lurid fantasies of harems and orgies. In both East and West, the truth was distorted, one side polishing it into sanctity, the other sensationalizing it into erotic myth. The result was the same. The real lives of Byzantine empresses were lost in shadows. The myth of Byzantium as a perfect holy empire is powerful because it reassures. It tells us that faith and law can create harmony, that an empire so long-lasting must have been free of corruption. But the reality is far more unsettling. The empire's longevity was sustained not only by law and faith, but by intrigue, manipulation, and ruthless survival within the palace itself. The empresses, often remembered as ornaments to the crown, were in fact its sharpest blades. This contrast between divine image and forbidden truth is what makes the Byzantine story so haunting. For every mosaic that glitters in Hagia Sophia, there is a shadowed chamber where a rival was strangled. For every hymn of devotion, there is a whispered scandal of seduction. The myth shows us gold. The reality hides the blood. And yet, it is precisely this contrast that grips us. Byzantium remains a mystery because it was both a kingdom of light and a labyrinth of shadows. To understand its true history, we must peel back the layers of sanctity and enter the private chambers where empresses ruled through desire, strategy, and scandal. It is there, behind the polished facade of civilization, that the forbidden secrets of Byzantine women are revealed. If Byzantium projected itself as God's kingdom on earth, then its palace was the stage where earthly desires and divine pretenses collided. At the heart of this world were the empresses, women who, despite living in a society that outwardly confined them, mastered the hidden art of power. Their weapons were not always armies or decrees, but subtler tools: seduction, intimacy, and the ability to turn private chambers into political arenas. The story of Theodora captures this transformation most vividly. Born not into nobility but to a bear-keeper at the hippodrome, she spent her youth as an actress, a profession in Byzantine society often associated with scandal and sexual immorality. Chroniclers hostile to her reign painted her early life in lurid detail, describing her performances in terms meant to shame. Yet this same woman rose to become the wife of Justinian the Wielded, co-ruler of the empire, and one of the most formidable empresses in Byzantine history. Her ascent was not merely a love story, but a political revolution. Through wit, charm, and ruthless cunning, she transformed scandal into authority, silencing critics and reshaping the empire from within. Once empress, Theodora used her influence in ways both shocking and groundbreaking. She championed women's rights, pushing for laws against forced prostitution and securing property rights for women. But she was equally known for her ruthlessness. When rival factions threatened Justinian, she famously declared she would rather die as empress than live in exile, a statement that steeled the emperor's resolve during the Nika riots, saving his throne. The same intimacy that bound her to Justinian became a shield and a sword. In private chambers, she directed policy as effectively as any general in the field. Theodora's story was not unique. Empress Zoe, centuries later, provides another example of seduction intertwined with strategy. Zoe, a member of the powerful Macedonian dynasty, was married 3 times, each union reshaping the empire's direction. Chroniclers accused her of taking lovers and plotting the downfall of rivals, painting her as both dangerously alluring and politically shrewd. Whether these accounts were truth or slander, they reveal how deeply the connection between intimacy and power was entrenched in Byzantine imagination. To sleep beside an emperor was not just privilege, it was proximity to empire itself. These women understood that in a court where men commanded armies and signed decrees, influence had to be exercised in other ways. Whispered words in the darkness, carefully staged gestures of devotion, or calculated displays of vulnerability could sway an emperor's mind as effectively as an army at the gates. Seduction in Byzantium was not simply about desire. It was strategy. But seduction was only the first step. Intimacy was quickly followed by manipulation, alliances, and, when necessary, cruelty. Rivals within the palace, sisters, stepmothers, concubines, could be poisoned, exiled, or forced into convents. Eunuchs, those ever-present guardians of the palace, became key players in these intrigues, carrying messages, arranging secret meetings, and ensuring silence where it was needed most. In this web of control, an empress could rise to extraordinary heights, but only if she was willing to wield power with both allure and ruthlessness. The irony is striking. Byzantium's public image exalted women as models of chastity and Christian virtue, yet its most powerful empresses thrived precisely by bending or breaking those ideals. They were cloaked in sanctity, their portraits preserved in mosaics beside emperors and saints, even as rumors swirled about their private lives. To the faithful outside the palace, they were symbols of divine order. To those within, they were political players whose seduction could determine succession, shift alliances, or decide the fate of wars. This duality, sanctity in public, scandal in private, defined the role of Byzantine empresses. Their power was hidden yet undeniable, forbidden yet essential. By mastering the delicate balance of desire and control, they secured influence in an empire that officially denied them authority. They understood that the most dangerous decisions were not always made in the throne room, but in the bedchamber. And so, Byzantium's survival often hinged not on the clash of swords, but on the murmur of secrets shared behind golden doors. Empresses turned intimacy into policy, seduction into statecraft, and desire into destiny. This was their strategy, a forbidden legacy disguised by mosaics of holiness, but preserved in whispers of scandal. To see its full impact, we must now step deeper into the palace shadows, where these strategies erupted into outright conspiracies, whilst betrayals, poisonings, and blood spilled behind the golden walls of Constantinople. If seduction was the entry point to power in Byzantium, scandal was its inevitable shadow. The golden palaces of Constantinople were not only places of worship and ceremony, they were also labyrinths of betrayal, where poison was mixed as often as incense burned, and where whispers in the bedchamber could decide who ruled and who died. Behind the shining mosaics, Byzantine history unfolded as a series of conspiracies, each one bloodier than the last. No tale illustrates this better than that of Empress Zoe, one of the most infamous women in Byzantine history. Born into the Macedonian dynasty, Zoe inherited power through her lineage, but it was her lovers and husbands who determined her rule. Married first to Romanos III, she was accused of poisoning him when his sudden death cleared the way for her. Next union, chroniclers painted her as a woman whose beauty had not faded even in middle age, describing how she captivated men even as her ambitions consumed them. Whether or not the poisonings were real, the suspicions reveal the fear that surrounded her, a fear of the empress who turned intimacy into lethal advantage. Her reign did not stop there. Zoe married Michael IV, who seized the throne, only to betray her by placing his own family into power and locking her away in a monastery. Yet even in exile, her influence endured. The people of Constantinople, outraged at her treatment, rioted until she was restored. She later ruled jointly with her sister Theodora, another woman accused of ruthless cunning. Together, they became living proof that the empire's destiny could be decided not by emperors, but by empresses cloaked in scandal. But Zoe was hardly alone. Centuries earlier, Irene of Athens became regent for her young son, Constantine VI. At first, she ruled in his name, but when he attempted to assert his independence, Irene's ambition turned merciless. In a chilling act of betrayal, she had her son seized and blinded, ensuring he would never rule again. The deed horrified contemporaries, yet it secured her sole authority as the first woman to officially reign as Byzantine emperor in her own right. Chroniclers struggled to reconcile this act with the empire's image of sanctity. Some condemned her as a monster, while others portrayed her as a necessary ruler in turbulent times. Either way, her name became forever tied to the darkest side of Byzantine politics. And then there was Theodora, wife of Justinian, whose enemies whispered that she never truly left behind her scandalous beginnings. Chroniclers hostile to her reign accused her of keeping lovers, manipulating court politics, and exacting vengeance on rivals with brutal efficiency. Though some of these tales were slander, their persistence reveals how power and scandal became inseparable for empresses. A woman could not rise so high without enemies painting her as depraved. And yet, sometimes the truth was as dark as the rumors. The palace itself was a breeding ground for intrigue. Eunuchs carried secrets between chambers, arranging conspiracies, or covering up scandals with silent efficiency. Poisonings were common weapons, often administered at feasts where golden goblets masked the danger within. Rivals vanished overnight, some sent into distant convents, others executed quietly, their deaths written off as divine will. The throne of Byzantium was not only won on battlefields, but in the private wars fought within silk-draped rooms. These scandals did more than shock the empire. They destabilized it. Coups erupted from palace betrayals. Generals switched loyalties under the influence of empresses, and dynasties collapsed under the weight of intimate conspiracies. Byzantium presented itself as a bastion of divine order, yet inside its most sacred palace, chaos reigned. And yet the paradox remained. Even as these women were vilified in chronicles, they were also admired. Some were remembered as saints, their sins scrubbed from memory by a church eager to preserve the empire's holy image. Others became legends of cunning, celebrated for their ability to outwit men in a world that sought to silence them. In both cases, the reality of blood and betrayal was rewritten, leaving behind a legacy both forbidden and irresistible. The contrast is stark. Outside, the faithful prayed in Hagia Sophia, their eyes lifted to heaven. Inside the palace, lovers plotted, rivals were strangled, and empresses schemed in candlelit chambers. Byzantium's greatest strength, its aura of sanctity, was also its greatest disguise, concealing a world of scandal and blood. But to truly understand the forbidden world of Byzantine empresses, we must move beyond the great scandals and look at the daily rhythms of palace life. For behind the golden mosaics and jeweled robes, the women who lived there endured a reality far stranger than the myths, a life of luxury bound tightly with fear. To outsiders, the Byzantine palace was a paradise of splendor. Its halls glittered with mosaics of gold, its courtyards overflowed with fountains and gardens, and its chambers were draped in silks imported from the far corners of the empire. Foreign envoys who glimpsed the great palace left stunned descriptions of its magnificence. Walls inlaid with jewels, thrones that gleamed in candlelight, and ceremonial processions that seemed to blur the line between earth and heaven. For the women who lived there, however, daily life was far more complex, a mixture of luxury and suffocation, indulgence and constant fear. An empress or courtwoman awoke each morning surrounded by opulence. Servants brought perfumes, oils and gowns, woven with threads of silver and gold. Breakfasts featured honeyed fruits, fresh bread, and exotic delicacies imported along Byzantine trade routes. From the outside, it appeared as if every desire was catered to, every comfort provided. Yet beneath this abundance lay a prison of ritual. Each day unfolded according to strict protocols, where they could walk, who they could speak with, even when they could appear in public. Surveillance was constant, carried out by eunuchs loyal only to the throne. Religious devotion shaped the rhythms of palace life. Empresses were expected to attend services in lavish private chapels, their piety displayed as proof of their virtue. Icons glimmered in candlelight, incense filled the air, and prayers echoed softly against marble walls. But even this devotion carried its duality. For while the women presented themselves as models of chastity and holiness, many also used religion as a shield, sponsoring churches, commissioning mosaics, and performing public acts of charity to disguise their private intrigues. Prayer and plotting existed side by side, each one reinforcing the other. The heart of daily existence was not freedom, but tension. Within the palace walls, women lived under constant threat. A smile misinterpreted, a whisper overheard, a rumor spread by a rival could mean exile or death. One day, a woman might be adorned in jewels and seated beside the emperor in public ceremony. The next, she might be stripped of titles and banished to a convent far from Constantinople. Power was intoxicating, but fragile. Social life revolved around feasts, ceremonies, and whispered alliances. Banquets dazzled with golden cups filled with spiced wine and tables laden with lamb, olives, and pastries. Yet even these moments of luxury carried danger. A cup could conceal poison, a toast could mask betrayal. Behind every performance of harmony lay rival factions, sisters competing for influence, courtiers scheming for advancement, empresses calculating their next move. For ordinary palace women, ladies in waiting, attendants, or companions, life was even more precarious. They enjoyed glimpses of luxury, but lived in the shadows of the empresses, their fates tied to the rise or fall of their mistresses. They could be elevated to positions of influence through loyalty, or discarded without mercy if caught in the wrong conspiracy. Their existence was a constant balancing act. Obedience offered survival, while ambition carried both promise and peril. The paradox of Byzantine palace life was that it looked like paradise, but often felt like captivity. The women were cloaked, in robes worth fortunes, yet they could not step outside the palace gates without permission. They lived surrounded by splendor, yet every choice was monitored, every movement calculated. They could wield power through charm, wit, and strategy, but always in silence, always beneath the shadow of danger. Daily life behind the veil was thus a performance, a careful dance between sanctity and scandal, obedience and defiance. Every prayer could hide a plot, every feast could conceal a betrayal. The women lived in constant awareness that their beauty, their influence, and their survival were fleeting. This was the reality behind the glittering mosaics admired by the world. A life of silks and shadows, where paradise and prison were one and the same. And it is within this tension, between sanctity and scandal, that the true forbidden legacy of Byzantine empresses emerges. For history remembers their splendor, but rarely the suffocating fear that shaped every moment of their existence. The Byzantine Empire is remembered as a civilization of golden domes, sacred relics, and emperors who ruled by the grace of God. Its legacy shines in mosaics that still glitter inside Hagia Sophia, in chronicles that speak of holy processions, and in the grandeur of a city once called the Eye of the World. Yet the true legacy of Byzantium is not only written in stone and scripture, it is also hidden behind the palace walls, in the whispers of scandals, the blood spilled in private chambers, and the forbidden power of empresses who ruled through intimacy and intrigue. This legacy has long been buried, sanitized, or transformed into myth. But to understand Byzantium fully, one must confront what history has tried to erase. The chroniclers of the empire played the first role in shaping memory. Many were monks, bishops, or scholars devoted to preserving the empire's holy image. For them, the empresses were either saints or sinners, nothing in between. A woman like Theodora could be described as divinely chosen when she supported the church, yet painted as depraved when her actions unsettled male authority. Zoe could be depicted as pious patroness in one account and as a poisoner in another. Irene could be praised as defender of orthodoxy, yet condemned as the mother who blinded her own son. In every case, the truth was bent to fit the needs of the state and the church. The complexities of these women's lives, their strategies, their survival, their humanity, were flattened into caricatures of virtue or vice. Western observers, too, distorted the story. Crusaders, merchants, and ambassadors carried tales back to Europe that transformed the Byzantine palace into a place of exotic indulgence. Empresses were imagined as sultry temptresses, harems of silken decadence, and courts awash with orgies and betrayal. These Orientalist fantasies blended truth with imagination, reducing Byzantine women to stereotypes that titillated foreign audiences while obscuring their real power. Between the silence of Byzantine chroniclers and the exaggerations of Western storytellers, the forbidden reality of palace life was almost entirely lost. Yet traces of truth remain. Accounts of coups, poisonings, and exiles cannot be dismissed as mere rumor. Archaeological finds reveal the physical grandeur of the palace, but they also echo the rituals of control. Private chapels built beside bedchambers, guarded passages designed for secrecy. These fragments suggest a world where sanctity and scandal existed side by side, where the same hands that lit candles before icons could also sign decrees of vengeance. The forbidden legacy of Byzantine empresses lies in this duality. They were both holy symbols and ruthless players, women cloaked in sanctity but living in shadows. Their power was never official. They could not lead armies or sit in the Senate. Yet their influence reached into every corner of the empire. They shaped policy through whispers, secured dynasties through seduction, and determined the fate of emperors through alliances sealed in private chambers. And though historians often tried to erase their role, the empire's survival in many moments depended on their cunning. Why then has their story been buried? Because it unsettles the myth of Byzantium as a holy empire. It forces us to see that its golden domes were built not only on faith and law, but also on secrets, betrayals, and forbidden desires. It reminds us that the same civilization that called itself God's kingdom on earth was also a place where women were forced to fight for survival in silken prisons, where intimacy became politics, and where blood could stain the marble floors of the palace as easily as incense perfumed them. This is not a tale unique to Byzantium. It is part of a larger pattern of how history remembers power. Rome polished the brutality of its gladiatorial games into symbols of glory. The Ottomans reframed the terror of their harems into romantic fantasies. Even modern nations sanitize their scandals, presenting monuments and myths while burying the voices of those who suffered beneath. Byzantium's forbidden legacy reminds us that every civilization has its shadows, and that those shadows are often where the most human stories lie. What makes the Byzantine case so haunting is the intensity of its contrast. Nowhere else did the image of divine sanctity clash so starkly with the reality of scandal. The mosaics that still gleam in gold depict empresses standing beside Christ and emperors, radiant with eternal light. Yet behind those images were women, accused of poisoning rivals, blinding sons, and conspiring with lovers. History preserves their portraits as saints, while their reality lingers only in whispers. And perhaps that is why this forbidden legacy continues to captivate. It is not only about scandal, it is about survival. These women lived in a world that denied them authority, yet they carved out influence through the only means available: intimacy, manipulation, strategy. They were vilified because they played the game too well, because they wielded power in ways the empire refused to acknowledge. Their stories are uncomfortable, not only because they involve seduction and blood, but because they reveal how much history has been written to erase women's true power. When tourists step into Hagia Sophia today, they marvel at its mosaics and domes. Few think about the chambers just beyond, where empresses plotted their moves and rivals vanished into exile. When textbooks mention Byzantium, they speak of emperors, armies, and theology, not of whispered conspiracies in candlelit corridors. Yet the empire cannot be fully understood without acknowledging both. The golden light and the forbidden shadows were two halves of the same whole. The forbidden legacy of Byzantine empresses is a reminder that history is never clean. It is shaped by myths, silences, and distortions. But the truth, however uncomfortable, always lingers. The golden walls of the great palace may have crumbled, but the stories of its women remain, waiting to be unearthed from the cracks. They challenge us to question not only how Byzantium is remembered, but how all civilizations choose what to reveal and what to conceal. And so, we return to the central question: How did women cloaked in sanctity manipulate intimacy to control an empire? The answer is simple and unsettling. Because they had to. Because the palace was both their cage and their battlefield. And because survival in Byzantium demanded it. Their forbidden secrets shaped the empire, even as history tried to bury them. This is the final truth. Byzantium was not only an empire of golden domes, it was an empire of secrets. And behind its shimmering facade, empresses ruled not with armies or decrees, but with whispers, seductions, and blood. That is the legacy the mosaics do not show, but one that echoes still. A reminder that every golden palace casts a shadow, and that within those shadows lie the stories that history calls forbidden.